I'm glad you raised that last point, Alexandre, because this is what I want to pick up on next. I certainly have seen a lot of analysis and writing about what's happening in France, and there are certainly a lot of people who are saying that, oh, you can't talk about Islamist extremism because it's perceived as racism, it's perceived as discrimination, and yet, as you say, there have been hundreds killed and over 1,000 wounded by this group. So let's turn to the Charlie Hebdo situation. So in 2015, of course, there was the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and the whole world reacted by saying, "Je suis Charlie." Okay, in other words, I support freedom of the press, and I absolutely denunciate this horrendous attack of a terrorist attack on people that were working on a newspaper. That was back in 2015. And yet you look at the recent beheading of Samuel Paty, I believe it was in October of last year, by a Chechen who was angered by the fact that he was discussing Charlie Hebdo and the infamous caricature, the Muhammad cartoons. The reaction was very different in your country and actually in around the world. My prime minister embarrassingly talked about respect rather than denouncing the act of terrorism. Why do you think there's been this shift from a support for freedom of the press, support for freedom of expression, denunciation of terrorism, to a much more muted response with respect to the beheading of Samuel Paty?
I would start to talk about the Je suis Charlie phenomenon. I think it was an interesting and a smart way to promote freedom of speech. Charlie Hebdo is a strong-willed journal. They have opinions that I don't share, especially on law enforcement. But they've been victim of a terrible attack, and at that moment, the important part was supporting them and saying that that wasn't okay. You couldn't attack journalists, you couldn't attack satirists because of a cartoon. In regard to what happened to Samuel Paty, so I'm quite familiar with the case. I had the opportunity to train the law enforcement response that arrived on scene just a couple of weeks before the attack took place. I think the attack was poorly perceived, and I think our friend Liam Duffy could mention that in his recent articles about the Anglo-Saxon press and trying to describe it as a case of law enforcement violence on a minority, and France being on the verge of turning to the far right. It's not the case. I think people in France were quite angered by the attack. We see a lot of people who used to be moderates or used to be, I say, lenient toward Islamist rhetoric, who said, okay, that was enough. We had a teacher being beheaded in the street for a class he gave about free speech and freedom of having different ideas. So I think a lot of French concept and a lot of the French context too was poorly understood by the Anglo-Saxon press and was used in a North American context as something as an equivalence, which it wasn't. I say that in France, so Samuel Paty received national homage from the president in the University of the Sorbonne. He's seen as a hero by a lot of French people, and I think a lot of them realize the danger of Islamist rhetoric and jihadist violence.